Liberal MP Gerard Kennedy. Mr. Kennedy, thanks very much for being here. You've introduced a private member's bill into this House that basically would protect war resistors from the United States, give them status here in Canada. Is that essentially right?
Essentially, those from the Iraq War, from a war that the legislation says is not sanctioned by the United Nations. So drawing a clear distinction and treating, in fact, the special conditions that arose with that war for the combatants and the fact that it gave rise to a number of people who had a conscientious objection from what they saw there, they felt they couldn't participate in, and the particular state of the United States Army did not allow them to be heard, often forced them to go back even after their contracts were done. For example, there's one gentleman who was 2 years away from retirement, a nuclear engineer, served his country, served his services, but just could not bring himself to be part of what he saw happening a second time in Iraq, tried to be transferred, tried other things, ultimately came to this country and said, "Can you help me? Can you agree with this?" with a Canadian sensibility, and this law is meant to address that.
So let's just deal with the technical side for a moment. Yeah. So what you're saying is, in your bill, if a soldier has served in Iraq and Afghanistan, as many of them do because the tours often intersect that way, they would not be eligible, but well, if it's just Iraq, they would be eligible?
Essentially, if someone came from service in Iraq, Afghanistan is a sanctioned war. It's only addressing, really, in this case, the Iraq war. There could be similar ones where they've had a genuine sincere religious or conscientious objection, and that's established, then they're eligible to be considered for immigration. And currently what we have instead is the Harper government imposing its much narrower view, which is basically that they don't even want to begin to offend the Americans and consider these folks the way we did a generation ago with Vietnam War, both draft dodgers and volunteers.
Okay, let me ask the question then. This seems to be more an internal debate for the United States in terms of figuring out their own war resistors and how their country is going to deal with their people and so on. But why just stop at the Iraq War? There are countries all over the world who order their armies into war that some soldiers may not feel comfortable with and so on. Why so narrow just on the Iraq War? Why not any country to any soldier who objects to any war?
Well, it is actually a little bit broader, although the way the different tests apply it narrows it down. But if there was another war where people found themselves in a very difficult circumstance, you know, there's other parts of the Immigration Act that address the kind of countries people are from. Ordinarily, someone from the U.S. can't claim, for example, persecution, whereas someone from numerous other countries, they do, and they do successfully, and in many cases very accurately. But this is meant to address that special circumstance we have with our friend and neighbor. It doesn't require us, I guess this bill says, to agree with them every time to be their friend. That there's a different sensibility here. It's specifically meant to address the 200 to 300 people who've come to us, as Vietnam War participants did at one time. And so this is really the consensus of the House. It's worded a little more broadly, but it's really meant to accept that group, or at least give them the chance of being here if they're otherwise eligible.
While we're on the subject, would you support a Canadian soldier seeking refuge in another country because he or she did not want to serve in Afghanistan?
Well, I think I would respect is another country could establish their view of that. I mean, that's what we're being asked to do here. This is about Canadian citizenship, and all I'm saying is that we should establish a standard, as a previous generation did, about our tolerances. Are they different? Is there a Canadian sensitivity here? And I'm saying that it at least deserves debate, and while that debate's taking place, people shouldn't be deported, because the ones that have faced pretty harsh sentences back in the United States, 15 months in a hard time in a military jail.
But Vietnam is very different from Iraq. This is a volunteer army these days. Vietnam was by draft or by conscription.
We accepted 10,000 Americans during the Vietnam War that were volunteers, though. They were volunteers who saw the conduct of the war in Vietnam and in such a fashion as to conscientiously object, or to have an objection. They were accepted and welcomed and are now part of the Canadian fabric. So, and another point I would make is that if you were an objector in the Canadian Army, you would get subject to a process and you'd be heard. It's not easy, but you would eventually either be reassigned or allowed to leave. The American Army, especially at the height of the Iraq War, wasn't doing that. And they did something, for example, called stop loss. You serve your entire time, you fulfill your contract, and they were able to go and make you go back to the Iraq War. So people couldn't do the other things that they might do when they see a war or something that they volunteered for and they want to get away from it. They were being forced to go back, and the bill addresses that compulsion as well.
How do you think the Americans are going to react to this?
Well, you know, actually these folks have gotten a lot of attention in the U.S. because a lot of people disagree with the Iraq War. The president disagreed with the Iraq War. He's pulling people out of the Iraq War.
Do you think the president would support the idea of us taking them in as refugees?
Yeah, I haven't talked to him. I didn't consult him on it. I think it's a matter for Canadians. But in the end of the day, this is certainly not meant to be in any way an offense to Americans. It's just to say we look at these matters of conscience a little bit differently. We looked at the Iraq War differently. We made a different decision to not participate in it. And all we're saying here is that people should get a hearing. Instead, Mr. Kenney has called them cowards. He has prejudiced his own panels who are supposed to make objective decisions by speaking out from his personal opinion. Instead, this is a matter for the Canadian people and their representatives. 2 motions have passed this House. He hasn't enacted them. We need a law now to give expression to what I think Canadians feel about these kind of circumstances.
A controversial debate, to say the least. Gerard Kennedy, thank you very much for being here. I appreciate your time.
Thank you. It's my pleasure.